There is a reason so many people live exhausted, even when the day has barely begun. There is a reason so many people feel constantly busy, yet never truly at peace. And no, it is not simply because they do not have enough time. For many people, the real problem is not too many tasks. It is too much inner disorder. Because when the mind is confused, even simple things feel heavy. When you do not know clearly what matters, anything can steal your attention. Every urgency becomes a priority. Every distraction gains power. And little by little, life starts to turn into a series of busy days with no real direction. You wake up, handle small things, put out fires, try to get organized, promise yourself tomorrow will be different. But tomorrow arrives and everything repeats itself. And the most dangerous part of all this is that chaos does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it disguises itself as routine. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary habits. Sometimes it looks like nothing more than fatigue, hurry, too many obligations, trouble focusing. But deep down, what is missing is not strength, it is order. Because a disorganized life does not begin with a messy desk. It does not begin with a phone full of notifications. It does not begin with being late or with procrastination. It begins in the mind. And that is why, in this video, I want to show you 7 principles to organize your mind and your life. Not with shallow formulas, not with empty promises, but with ideas that can change the way you think, decide, act, and build your days. Because when the mind comes into order, time stretches further. Decisions become clearer. Peace begins to return. And what once felt impossible finally starts to move. Pay close attention to this. The first principle may be the most important of them all, because many people try to control their lives before they have any clarity about what they are actually building. And a person who lives that way may work hard, yet still keep going in circles. Asterisk, principle 1. Clarity before control. If you try to organize a life without knowing where it is meant to go, you will turn organization into exhaustion. That is the mistake many people make. They want more discipline, more focus, more productivity, better performance, a better routine. But they have not stopped to answer one fundamental question. What exactly am I trying to build? Without that answer, even productivity can become waste. Because it does not matter how fast you run if you are heading in the wrong direction. It does not matter how full your calendar is if your heart still feels empty. It does not matter how many tasks you complete if those tasks are disconnected from a clear vision for your life. That is why so many people do so much and still feel like they are going nowhere. It is not that they lack effort. They lack an axis. And when there is no axis, the mind splits. One part wants growth, another wants comfort. One part wants change. Another wants to stay where things feel familiar. One part says it is time to mature. Another still clings to distractions, impulses, and escape. That is when the inner conflict begins. You want to move forward, but you sabotage yourself. You want peace, but you keep feeding excess. You want focus, but you have not decided what truly deserves it. You want a better life, but you keep allowing everything that interrupts the life to stay. Without clarity, the mind becomes a territory of competing desires. And a divided mind cannot produce a stable life. That is why the first principle is this. Before you try to control your days, you must clarify your direction. You need to know what you are trying to strengthen. Maybe it is your spiritual life. Maybe it is your emotional stability. Maybe it is your discipline. Maybe it is your career. Maybe it is your peace. Maybe it is your maturity. Maybe it is a life that is simpler, cleaner, more intentional. Whatever it is, it needs to become clear. Because clarity does something powerful. It removes the weight of many unnecessary decisions. When you know what you are building, it becomes easier to say no. easier to recognize what distracts you, what weakens you, what delays you, what only takes up space. Many people are exhausted not because they do too much, but because they decide too much. They decide constantly, rethink constantly, hesitate constantly, start without conviction, stop for no real reason, change direction because of every outside influence. That wears the mind down. A clear life feels lighter because it reduces inner friction. You do not have to debate with yourself all the time once you know what deserves priority. And here is something important. Clarity does not mean having your whole life figured out. It does not mean knowing every step. It does not mean having all the answers. It does not mean seeing the entire next year in advance. Clarity means knowing, at the very least, what kind of person you want to become and what direction you are no longer willing to abandon. That alone changes everything. Because from that point on, you stop merely reacting to whatever appears and begin filtering your life with greater awareness. You start noticing that many things that once felt urgent were really just noise. And the more noise there is in your life, the less able you are to hear what truly matters. Maybe that is why so many people live in confusion. They are overexposed. Too many opinions, too much content, too much comparison, too many invitations, too many stimuli. And in the middle of all that excess, they lose the ability to sense their own direction. That is why organizing the mind does not begin with apps, planners, or goals. It begins with a quiet decision. I am not going to live carelessly anymore. That decision changes your posture, because the person who makes that decision starts looking at themselves with more honesty. They stop asking only, how can I do more? And start asking, what truly deserves my energy? That question is worth gold, because not everything that fills your day deserves to fill your life. And until you can tell the difference, you will stay tired for reasons you do not fully understand. Now let me tell you something very important. A mind without clarity usually falls into 3 traps. The first is the illusion of movement. The person is always doing something, so they assume they are progressing. But activity is not progress. Motion is not direction. The second is dependence on urgency. Because the essential has never been defined, they spend their life responding to whatever shouts the loudest. And what matters most keeps losing to what feels immediate. The third is emotional fatigue. Living without clarity consumes energy in a silent way. The mind never fully rests. It is always trying to find itself in the middle of the noise. That is why people who appear productive can still be deeply lost. What they need is not just rest. They need alignment. And alignment begins with clarity. So here is a simple but powerful practice for applying this first principle. Take a sheet of paper and answer honestly. What do I want to strengthen in my life right now? What is weakening me? What is taking up space today, but building nothing real? What kind of person do I need to become in order to live the life I say I want? Do not write pages. Write truthfully. Because when truth appears, order begins. Maybe your answer is, I need to strengthen my peace. Or, I need to strengthen my focus. Or, I need to stop living scattered. Or even, I need to build a routine that gives me back my dignity. Any one of those answers can become a compass. And when you find that compass, you no longer have to run desperately after everything. You begin to walk with intention. There is a huge difference between a busy life and an intentional one. A busy life is full. An intentional life is aligned. A busy life ends the day exhausted. An intentional life ends the day knowing why it did what it did. A busy life reacts. An intentional life builds. That is why this first principle comes before all the others. Because without clarity, discipline becomes a burden. Focus becomes blind effort. Planning becomes an empty list. and routine becomes a cage. But once clarity enters, everything starts making sense. You begin to understand what needs to start, what needs to stop, what needs to continue, and most importantly, what no longer belongs in the life you want to build. Clarity does not solve everything at once, but it turns on the light. And once the light is on, it becomes much harder to pretend you cannot see, because clarity alone is not enough. You also need to understand why so many people remain tired, overwhelmed, and mentally scattered even while trying to keep up with everything. It is not enough to know where to go. You must also recover the mental strength needed to sustain that direction. Asterisk, asterisk, Principle 2. Simplify to recover mental strength, asterisk, asterisk. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from hard work. It does not come from physical effort. It does not come from a demanding routine. It does not even come from lack of sleep. It comes from excess. Too many choices, too many stimuli, too much information, too many things open at once inside the mind. And that is one of the reasons so many people today feel drained, even when they cannot fully explain why. Because the human mind was not designed to be pulled in 10 directions at the same time. But that is exactly how many people live. They open their phone first thing in the morning and instantly receive opinions, news, notifications, messages, demands, comparisons, short videos, quick promises, artificial urgencies. Before the day has even begun, the mind has already been hijacked. And then they try to focus, try to produce, try to get organized, try to find peace. But how can they? Inside, they already began the day fragmented. This is something many people do not realize. You cannot build an organized life with a permanently overloaded mind. That is why the second principle matters so much. Simplify in order to recover mental strength. Because when everything is complicated, everything becomes weaker. You have probably felt this before. You have several things to do, but instead of moving with clarity, you freeze. You overthink, open too many fronts, switch tasks constantly. Start one thing, interrupt it, move to something else, come back, forget, get distracted, try to compensate, feel guilty. And by the end of the day, you have spent too much energy for too little progress. That is not only a discipline problem. Often, it is mental saturation. It is the mind trying to handle more than it was meant to handle. And an overloaded mind starts losing quality in small decisions. It postpones what is simple, complicates what is straightforward, turns light things into heavy ones, and becomes less reliable when it comes to choosing priorities. That is why one of the fastest ways to begin organizing your life is to reduce the number of things competing for your attention. Because every choice has a cost. Every interruption takes energy. Every mental opening left unresolved occupies inner space. How many unnecessary decisions do you make every day? What to wear? What to answer? Where to start? What to consume? What to think about? What to prioritize? Whether to keep going or switch paths? Whether to do it now or later? Whether to finish or restart? It sounds small, but all of that trains the mind in silence. And when the mind becomes tired, it starts looking for shortcuts. It chooses what is easy instead of what is important, what is immediate instead of what is valuable, what is comfortable instead of what is coherent. That is when life starts slipping out of alignment, not because of lack of ability, but because of too much dispersion. Many people think freedom means keeping every possibility open. But in reality, a better life usually begins when you start closing unnecessary doors, when you reduce options, simplify routes, decide ahead of time, stop negotiating with everything. That brings relief, because the mind rests when it finds structure. And that structure does not need to be sophisticated. It needs to be functional. Maybe what is stealing your peace today is not one giant problem. Maybe it is a series of repeated complications. a routine with no sequence, an environment full of stimulation, a calendar without clear criteria, a phone always within reach, too many promises and too little definition, too much consumption and almost no digestion, too much noise and almost no silence. All of that creates a kind of inner pollution. And a polluted mind cannot sustain focus for very long. That is why simplifying does not make life poorer. It clears the path. It removes what is interrupting your strength. Some people do not need more techniques. They need less excess. They need to stop living surrounded by so many things competing with one another. Because when everything seems important, nothing receives the depth it requires. And without depth, the mind loses presence. It keeps jumping from subject to subject, from tab to tab, from goal to goal, from emotion to emotion, from idea to idea, from impulse to impulse. Over time, that destroys something very precious, the ability to remain in a task, remain in a process, remain in a plan, remain in silence, remain with what truly matters. And without that ability, a person lives in a permanent state of restarting. They may have good intentions, but they cannot sustain enough presence to turn intention into construction. That is why simplifying is an act of strength, because it requires the maturity to admit that not everything deserves access to your life. Not every piece of information deserves your mind. Not every invitation deserves your time. Not every conversation deserves your energy. Not every curiosity deserves your attention. There is power in selecting. There is peace in reducing. There is wisdom in making life simpler so the essential can have room. And here is a difficult truth. Many people complicate their own lives because deep down, they have grown accustomed to excess, accustomed to noise, accustomed to rushing, accustomed to overload, accustomed to the feeling of always chasing something. So when silence appears, it feels strange. When simplicity appears, it feels like too little. When the day becomes lighter, it creates anxiety, because repeated chaos becomes familiar. And whatever becomes familiar starts feeling normal. But normal does not mean healthy. Some routines look ordinary, yet they are destroying the mind's clarity. Some habits seem harmless, yet they are dissolving the ability to concentrate. Some excesses look small, yet they are keeping your life unnecessarily tired. That is why applying this principle requires the courage to make cuts. Cut what takes up space, but builds nothing. Cut what overstimulates and gives little in return. Cut the repeated impulses that weaken your stability. Cut even certain forms of consumption that leave your mind heavy and restless. Because simplifying is choosing a kind of peace that excess will never be able to give you. And here is a powerful practice for this second principle. Ask yourself 3 questions. What is making my mind heavier than it needs to be right now? What choices can I make ahead of time so I do not waste energy? What do I need to reduce in order to think more clearly? These questions may sound simple, but if you answer them honestly, they reveal a great deal. Maybe you will realize you need to reduce screen time. Maybe you will realize you need to stop beginning your day on your phone. Maybe you will see that you are trying to do too many things at once. Maybe you will notice that your routine is full of input and almost no processing. And that matters, because the mind does not only need to receive, it needs to absorb. A mind that only consumes but never reflects becomes full, and empty at the same time, full of stimuli, empty of direction. That is why simplifying also means creating space. Space to think, space to notice, space to breathe, space to decide consciously instead of reacting on impulse. And when that space appears, something changes. The rush slows down, perception improves, priorities become clearer, and what once felt confusing begins to reorganize itself inside you. Because order is not born only from what you add to life. Often, it is born from what you finally choose to remove. Life grows stronger when it stops being so crowded with things that do not belong together. You do not need to control everything, but you do need to stop allowing everything into your mind without a filter. That filter is part of maturity. A mature person understands that protecting the mind is just as important as feeding their dreams. Because dreams without mental protection turn into frustration. Plans without inner space turn into anxiety. And good intentions without simplification turn into weight. When you simplify, you give the mind a chance to function with more dignity. You think better, choose better, act better, rest better. But there is still another problem holding many people back. The cycle of starting, stopping, feeling frustrated, and beginning again. Clarity is not enough. Simplification is not enough. You also need to learn how to sustain a direction without depending on bursts of motivation. Asterisk, asterisk, Principle 3. Stop restarting and learn to sustain asterisk, asterisk. There is a huge difference between changing your life and living through small bursts of motivation. Many people confuse the two. They get excited, decide that this time things will be different, make plans, organize everything for 1 or 2 days, start strong, but soon after, they stop. Then comes frustration, guilt, the feeling of failing again. And after that, another restart. That cycle destroys more than results. It destroys trust. Because over time, the person begins to doubt themselves. They no longer suffer only because they cannot keep a routine. They suffer because deep down, they start believing they cannot sustain anything. And that is one of the roots of disorganization, living in constant restart mode instead of building continuity. That is why the third principle is this: stop restarting all the time and learn to sustain the process. Because a solid life is not built by intense moments. It is built by staying power. The problem is that many people have been taught to admire intensity. This is it, energy. That strong feeling of immediate transformation. That rush of believing everything changed in a single decision. But the truth is that most real change does not happen in excitement. It happens in repetition, on ordinary days, on days with no applause, on days when you do not feel especially inspired, yet you keep going anyway. That is when life truly begins to change. Because constantly restarting can look like hope, but often it is just a lack of structure. The person did not build a sustainable rhythm. They built only an emotional impulse. An impulse cannot sustain destiny. What sustains destiny is consistency. That is why you need to stop thinking only about how to start right and begin thinking about how to continue in a way that is realistic. That shift is powerful. Because often you do not fail because you are incapable. You fail because you create a routine you cannot carry. You want to change everything at once. Fix your whole life in a few days. Make up for years of confusion in a single week. And that almost always ends the same way. Exhaustion. The mind gets tired. The body resists. Motivation fades, and the plan collapses. After that, the person concludes they lack discipline. But many times, what they really lacked was wisdom. They failed to understand that consistency matters more than intensity. A small change sustained long enough has more power than a huge effort that does not last. A person who truly organizes their life learns to respect the rhythm of construction. They do not despise a small beginning. They do not abandon the process because it feels slow. They do not turn every failure into a final sentence. They simply return to center and continue. That is maturity. Because a well-built life does not depend on perfection. It depends on return. You do not need to stop failing forever. You need to stop turning every failure into abandonment. That difference changes everything. An immature person thinks, I failed, so I lost the rhythm. A mature person thinks, I failed, so I need to adjust and keep going. That is what preserves continuity. And continuity is a silent force. It does not draw as much attention as dramatic beginnings, but it is what produces real transformation. It is what reorganizes the mind, what strengthens identity, what helps you stop seeing yourself as unstable. Because every time you sustain a direction, even imperfectly, you send yourself a message. I am capable of staying. And that message heals a great deal. It heals a fragmented self-image, heals the feeling of constant failure, heals that quiet pain of always starting from zero. So as you apply this principle, change the question. Instead of asking, how can I change everything right now? Ask, what can I truly sustain? That is the question that builds. Maybe you cannot change 10 habits right now, but perhaps you can sustain 2. Maybe you cannot reorganize your whole life this week, but perhaps you can establish a minimal routine. Maybe you are not at the ideal point yet, but you can already step out of improvisation, and that is enough to begin generating stability. Because stability is not born from grand promises. It is born from repeated practices. But even a person who learns how to sustain the process can still be sabotaged by something else, their environment. Wanting consistency is not enough. You must create a life that stops pushing you backward. Asterisk, asterisk, principle 4. Organize your environment so you do not have to fight it, asterisk, asterisk. Many people believe the problem exists only inside them. They think they lack willpower, think they lack focus, think they lack discipline. But in many cases, what is sabotaging their life is not only the mind, it is the environment around them. Because the environment you live in either supports your direction or feeds your disorder. And that is a point many people ignore. They want to change their lives, yet remain surrounded by the same distractions, the same triggers, the same clutter, the same logic of improvisation. They want focus, but leave their attention exposed to everything. They want peace, but live in a setting that stimulates hurry, excess, and fragmentation. That is why the 4th principle is this. Organize your environment so you do not have to fight it all the time. Because when the environment works against you, the mind must work twice as hard, and over time, that wears you down. You spend energy not only doing what matters, but also resisting what keeps pulling you away. This applies to many things. It applies to the space where you work, to the way you begin your day, to easy access to distractions, to visual clutter, to the absence of routine, even to the company you keep and the conversations that feed your mind. Everything communicates. Everything influences. Everything makes the kind of life you are trying to build either easier or harder. A person who wants concentration but lives in constant interruption will suffer more. A person who wants discipline but leaves everything to improvisation will sabotage themselves more. A person who wants peace but remains immersed in excess will always feel internally behind. That is why organization is not just about calendars. Organization is also about life design. It is preparing the setting so that what is right becomes easier and what is harmful stops being so accessible. That is practical wisdom. Because trusting only willpower is dangerous. Willpower fluctuates. Environment remains. If your environment favors dispersion, you will have to overcome yourself all day long. But when your environment favors order, many things begin to flow with less friction. And this does not require a perfect life. It requires intention. Maybe you need fewer visible stimuli. Maybe you need to keep your phone farther away during certain hours. Maybe you need to prepare the night so the morning becomes easier. Maybe you need to clean the space where you think, work, or pray. Maybe you need to stop leaving important decisions for emotionally charged moments. Small adjustments change a great deal because the environment shapes behavior far more than many people admit. If everything around you invites distraction, you will become more distracted. If everything pushes you toward improvisation, you will live putting out fires. If everything communicates urgency, your mind will never learn to slow down. So ask yourself honestly, does the environment I live in today match the life I want to build? That question reveals a lot. Because sometimes what you call lack of discipline is simply lack of structure. And structure is a form of care. Care for your attention. Care for your energy. Care for your peace. But even with clarity, simplification, consistency, and a more supportive environment, there is still a silent barrier left. Knowing what needs to be done and continuing to postpone it. That is where the next principle begins. Asterisk, asterisk, Principle 5. Stop negotiating with what is essential, asterisk, asterisk. There is a kind of strain that almost no one notices right away. It does not come only from work, responsibilities, or a busy routine. It begins within. It arises whenever you know what needs to be done, yet keep putting it off. That silent tension consumes energy. The mind gets trapped between two forces. On one side, your conscience showing you what must be faced. On the other, your attempt to push it off until later. That is where many people get lost. They understand that certain habits need to change. They can see the excess they are carrying. They recognize that some decisions require maturity. But instead of acting, they keep softening the problem with internal promises. I will deal with it later. I will get organized afterward. Now is not the right time. I just need a little more time. Those phrases sound small, but they are expensive. That is why the fifth principle is this: stop negotiating with what is essential. Everything that has already become clear inside you and is still being postponed begins to weaken your inner firmness. That is the central point. This is not just about procrastination. It is about the erosion of your own authority. Every time you know what you need to do and choose to step away from it, the mind learns a dangerous message. Your word to yourself is not as strong as it should be. Over time, that broken trust creates disorder. Direction weakens. Focus loses consistency. Discipline feels more distant. Even simple tasks begin carrying unnecessary emotional weight. The problem is rarely only the issue that needs solving. Much of the suffering comes from prolonged resistance to what should already have been faced. That is what is so exhausting. A postponed choice occupies space. A boundary never set continues to drain energy. A harmful habit tolerated too long leaves the mind at war with itself. Ignoring does not bring relief. It only prolongs the burden. What is essential does not disappear just because it has been avoided. It remains in the background of your conscience, asking for definition, consuming presence, fragmenting peace. That is why so many people live with a sense of heaviness, even without any obvious crisis. They are not only overloaded by life's responsibilities, they are tired of carrying inner unfinished business. And unfinished inner business has tremendous power. It steals clarity, steals lightness, steals emotional energy. A strong mind is not one that never feels difficulty. It is one that does not turn the necessary into an endless debate. This principle requires maturity. Organizing your life does not only involve building routines, setting goals, or controlling time. It involves stopping the habit of running away from what is already demanding a decision. Some things keep disorganizing your life because you are still trying to coexist with them instead of resolve them. And while that continues, the mind cannot rest. Part of your energy remains trapped there, trying to manage the discomfort, justify the delay, search for distractions, so you do not have to face what has already become obvious. That avoidance can take many forms. Sometimes it appears as overbusyness, sometimes as constant distraction, sometimes as elegant rationalizations that merely hide the truth. But underneath it all, the logic is the same. What should have been dealt with is still being carried. And carrying what needs to be resolved is heavier than resolving it. That is a difficult truth, but it is freeing. The discomfort of an honest decision is usually lighter than the wear of continuing to postpone the inevitable. When you finally face what needs to be faced, something begins to reorganize inside you. The mind stops wasting energy on resistance. Tension decreases. Perception clears. Conscience begins to breathe again. And that strengthens one of the foundations of inner order: trust in yourself. Because every time you act in alignment with what you know is necessary, your identity grows firmer. You stop being someone who merely understands the problem and start becoming someone who responds to what they have already understood. That shift is profound. It restores dignity, restores direction, restores respect for your own word. And without that self-respect, no form of organization can last for very long. What is essential must stop being treated like an option. It needs to take its place as a silent priority, not because it feels pleasant, but because it is what sustains a life in order. But even a person who decides to face the essential can still lose momentum if they do not learn how to protect their attention. And today, that may be one of the greatest battles of modern life. Asterisk, asterisk, Principle 6. Protect your attention to protect your life, asterisk, asterisk. Attention has become one of the most disputed assets in the world. Almost everything around you is trying to capture it. Screens, notifications, conversations, urgencies, short-form content, comparisons, constant distractions. There is always something asking for entrance into your mind. And the problem is not only the number of stimuli, it is the effect those stimuli produce within you. A fragmented attention creates a fragmented life. That is the point. Whoever cannot protect their focus begins to lose depth, lose presence, lose direction, lose the ability to stay with something important long enough to turn effort into results. That is why the sixth principle is this: protect your attention to protect your life. Because attention does not only decide what you think about, it influences who you become. Whatever regularly receives your mind begins to shape your inner state. Whatever repeatedly occupies your thoughts begins to influence your mood, your choices, your energy, and even your vision of the future. That is why so many people feel mentally exhausted without having done anything truly meaningful. The mind worked all day, but it worked in dispersion. It was pulled from one side to another, interrupted again and again, exposed to a sequence of content and impulses that built nothing solid. In the end, all that remains is exhaustion without the feeling of progress. That kind of depletion is dangerous because it feels normal. The person gets used to living interrupted, gets used to changing focus in seconds, gets used to consuming too much and absorbing too little. And over time, they lose something very precious: the ability to hold attention on what truly matters. Without that, any project weakens. Any routine becomes fragile. Any attempt at change turns unstable. Wanting a better life is not enough. You must mentally defend the construction of that life. That requires discernment. Not everything that appears deserves entry. Not everything that calls for you needs an immediate response. Not everything that sparks curiosity deserves space in your mind. That filter is a form of protection, because a mind that is too open becomes too vulnerable. And constant vulnerability does not go well with inner order. Attention works like a door. If it stays unlocked all the time, the inner environment loses stability. Random thoughts multiply. Anxiety increases. Comparisons gain power. Focus weakens before it even begins. That is why organizing your life also means selecting what is allowed to remain in your mind. That selection is worth gold. It applies to what you consume, to the conversations you entertain, to the kind of content you follow, to the way you begin and end your day. If your morning already begins in distraction, your mind starts at a disadvantage. If your day ends in overstimulation, your rest loses quality. If your focus is constantly interrupted, peace never takes root. Protected attention does not mean extreme rigidity. It means awareness. It means stopping the habit of being available to everything, because whoever stays available to everything ends up absent from themselves. And that comes at a high cost. Without stable attention, you start many things and deepen almost none of them. You listen, but do not absorb. Work, but never fully enter into it. Plan, but do not sustain. Even important moments pass through your life without leaving enough mark. That is how the mind becomes shallow, restless, and tired. The modern world rewards speed, but real life is still built through depth. The most important transformations do not happen in impulsive moments. They happen when you are able to remain. Remain learning. Remain practicing. Remain reflecting. Remain with what is worth it, even when everything else calls louder. That kind of staying power does not happen by accident. It depends on protection. You must decide what will nourish your focus and what will stop competing with it. That decision changes a great deal. The mind starts breathing better. Anxiety decreases. Thought becomes sharper. Priorities stop feeling so tangled. And then you realize something powerful. Much of what looked like lack of discipline was actually too much interruption. Much of what looked like weakness was stolen attention. Much of what looked like incapacity was simply a mind exhausted from being pulled in every direction. When your attention becomes yours again, life starts recovering its direction. But there is still one last step, because organizing your mind and your life does not only depend on beginning well, it depends on reviewing, adjusting, and correcting your course honestly, so you do not drift back into chaos without noticing. Principle 7. Review your life so you do not return to chaos. A life does not fall out of alignment all at once. Most of the time, disorder returns through small concessions. A day without attention, a postponed choice, a broken routine, an excess that gets tolerated, a distraction repeated until it becomes a pattern. That is how many people lose themselves again. Not through dramatic collapses, but through small deviations that accumulate over time. That is why the 7th principle is this: review your life so you do not return to chaos. Because the person who never stops to observe their own direction ends up being carried away by autopilot. An autopilot almost never builds a conscious life. It only repeats habits, repeats mistakes, repeats excuses, repeats forms of exhaustion that should have been understood by now. Without review, a person keeps living through similar weeks, feeling similar burdens, repeating the same excesses, and calling it a season. But what is not observed is rarely corrected. That is the point. Review interrupts blind repetition. It gives awareness back to the path. When you stop to look at your life honestly, you begin to notice where you lost strength, where you got distracted, where you moved away from what truly matters. And that is not for guilt. It is for adjustment. Because an organized life is not a life that never fails. It is a life that notices more quickly when it has moved out of alignment. That awareness shortens the lifespan of chaos. Instead of spending months lost, you catch it early. Instead of letting the wear grow, you correct it sooner. Instead of insisting on harmful patterns, you reposition yourself. That is what review does. It protects the construction. Without it, even good seasons can slip through your hands. Without it, even useful habits can weaken. Without it, even well-intentioned people drift back into reaction mode. Because life requires maintenance. Your mind needs alignment. Your routine needs observation. Your heart needs truth. Wanting order is not enough. You must verify whether order is still alive inside the way you are living. And that review does not have to be complicated. It has to be sincere. At the end of the day or the week, You can ask yourself, what strengthened me? What drained me? Where was I aligned with the life I want to build? Where did I begin moving away from it? Questions like these may seem simple, but they carry power. They pull you out of autopilot. They clear perception. They prevent disorder from growing in silence. Because ignored chaos multiplies. Observed chaos starts losing power. And there is something deeply valuable in the practice of review. It matures your relationship with yourself. You stop treating yourself only with pressure and start treating yourself with responsibility. That difference is enormous. Pressure without awareness only produces weight. Responsibility with clarity produces change. A person who reviews their own life learns how to correct without self-destruction, learns how to recognize failure without turning it into identity, learns how to return to center without dramatizing every deviation. That creates emotional stability, because the person stops thinking in terms of either I am perfect or I ruined everything. They begin to understand that living well depends on observing, adjusting, and continuing. This principle closes all the others. Clarity must be reviewed. Simplicity must be protected. Consistency must be observed. Environment must be readjusted. The essential must keep its place as a priority. Attention must be defended again and again. Without review, everything comes loose. With review, everything gains continuity. And that is what sustains a life in order. Not the illusion of total control, but the humility to observe yourself regularly. Whoever does this grows with greater consistency, gets lost less often, returns faster, and learns to live with far more awareness than most people ever do. At the end of the day, organizing your mind and your life does not mean becoming a machine. It does not mean living in rigidity. It does not mean controlling every detail. And it certainly does not mean never failing again. It means living with greater awareness. It means refusing to be dragged around by impulses, distractions, excesses, and disorders that, for too long, seem normal. Because the truth is simple. A better life does not begin when everything around you changes. It begins when something inside you decides it will no longer accept living carelessly. That is where transformation begins. When you gain clarity about what you are building. When you reduce the excess draining your mind. When you stop restarting all the time and learn to sustain the process. When you adjust your environment so it supports your direction. When you stop negotiating with what you already know must be done. When you protect your attention like something valuable. And when you review your life so you do not quietly return to the same place. These principles do not exist to impress. They exist to align. Because chaos rarely destroys everything at once. It enters little by little, through tolerated distraction, through delayed decisions, through lack of discernment, through routine without awareness. And in the same way, order is also built little by little, in small choices, in quiet adjustments, in firm decisions no one sees, but that change the direction of everything. And maybe that is what you most need to remember today. You do not have to solve your entire life at once, but you do have to stop feeding what is weakening you. Order begins when honesty begins. Peace begins when confusion is no longer accepted as a way of life. And strength begins when your mind understands that it will no longer live without direction. If this video spoke to you, do not let it end as just another moment of inspiration. Take at least one of these principles and begin applying it today. Not all of them at once. One real adjustment. One clean decision. One necessary cut. One change that gives your mind a little more clarity and your life a little more steadiness. Because that is how a life is rebuilt. Not in one grand speech, but in one genuine practice at a time. And if you made it this far, leave this in the comments. ***. Today, I choose to live with more order. I want to read that comment. And if this content helped you, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. Because here we do not talk only about temporary motivation. We talk about inner transformation, mental clarity, and principles that truly strengthen a life. And share this video with someone who needs to step out of chaos, recover their focus, and bring their life back into order. I will see you in the next video.